And I think there are some philosophical problems with arguing that God remains timeless after he creates the universe. It'd be weird. It would kind of force the Christian adopting that perspective to adopt the B theory of time, which he could do. But to me, it still doesn't solve the problem, because if God is withdrawing from time, right, if he has the ability to enter into time and then withdraw from it, well, in his present state of being withdrawn, when did Jesus enter human history? You couldn't answer that question if God is now outside of time. Again, it was true that he would enter human history, and now for God it's true that he already did those things. All right, well, I'm glad to have my next guest. We actually met through Reasonable Faith, both being chapter directors under William Lane Craig. His Facebook page you can look for is Thrive Apologetics. James Rebel Jamias, thank you so much for being here.
Hey, yeah, thanks for having me, man.
Yeah, well, got a lot to talk to. We've been talking, over text. This is our first time video chatting. But I guess, but before we get into like some of the stuff we've talked about talking about, maybe just give the audience a background on you, how you came to faith, and through that journey where apologetics came in.
Yeah, I've probably been a Christian probably for maybe 8 or 9 years now, and I remember the person who led me to faith. He showed me a 3-minute video of this guy named Ravi Zacharias, and so I guess he was on his talk show, and he actually proved the existence of God in under 3 minutes. And I remember like at that time just being like blown away. I'm like, I thought it was just all faith. I didn't know that there was any sort of real evidence or you could prove God's existence in any way. And so I remember watching that video and just being very just captivated. And so kind of just led me to go to YouTube and watch his other videos. So I was obsessed with Ravi Zacharias for a long time. I still like him to this day. I've pretty much watched all his lectures on Facebook. I've actually went to go see him a couple times when he was here in California. But yeah, once you kind of know one apologist, you kind of start to know who the others are. And so I kind of knew who his colleagues were. And then, eventually, I don't know how I stumbled upon a debate with William Lane Craig. It was one of his debates where he was in, I think it was Mexico City, where it was like 3 versus 3. So it was him and 2 other guys versus Richard Dawkins and 2 other guys. But I remember William Lane Craig standing out, on his team. I'm like, he's very good in terms of like how he's speaking. I remember like he's pretty much just like a one-man team. Like him himself was destroying the other team. But then eventually, I kind of saw the other related videos, and I saw his one versus Christopher Hitchens, and I was like, what the heck? Like, this is amazing. And so, yeah, ever since then, like I just really been just reading, watching, just learning, like just taking in everything with apologetics. I've become like a apologetics junkie. That's why you can see like I have all these books. Like I never used to be a reader until I became a Christian. And especially, when I, got into apologetics, that's when I really started reading books. And so that's the reason like why I love knowledge in general, is because apologetics. And so I think I'm a better person because of it overall.
Yeah, it's funny. The more you learn, the more you realize there is to learn. And it's one of those, it's non-linear kind of. It's like you read one book and then, well, now there's 10 more I got to read because he referenced 10 different authors. It's kind of funny how that happens.
Yeah, I find out whenever I read one book, I end up buying 3 to replace it. And so this is never ending, so since I have no more room on my shelf for books, I'm kind of been going like the Nook or Kindle route, trying to have books just in one place because I got no more space. But
yeah, well, that's awesome that you came to faith through apologetics. I always find that's interesting. Me personally, when people ask me, I kind of have a boring story. It's like, well, I was raised in the church. I was always Christian, and then it kind of makes you feel like, well, maybe did I have a bias? But so then anytime I hear about someone like you, who it was the arguments that made you consider it, that kind of destroys the atheists' when they kind of commit the genetic fallacy and just say, oh, well, it's depend on where you were raised, or if you had parents that indoctrinated you, then you'll become a Christian. But, you came through the evidence. And I don't know if you have maybe a favorite particular argument. What was in the Ravi Zacharias video that you saw that kind of really intrigued you?
It's actually been a while. I know he was talking about like something about the like DNA or the genome, and
Mm,
how like the possibility of that existing is like 10 to the power of uh 40,000 or something like that. And so like it was like some crazy number where you know I think it's obviously some sort of intelligent design argument of how like the chances of us being here is so great. But yeah, it's been a while since I watched the video, and
yeah.
I've kind of forgot the details, but yeah, it was something like that where he used science. I was like, what
Hmm.
the heck? Yeah, I'll have to find that video because that video is special to me because of that, because
Yeah.
of where it led me.
Yeah. So now, would you say you have a favorite particular argument, or would it just be kind of the cumulative case?
Um, I guess my favorite two arguments would probably be like, the Kalam cosmological argument or the moral argument,
Mm,
because I feel like when it comes to just like general revelation in general, that those two arguments kind of uh, meet us where we're at the most, because even if you don't know the arguments, you can still infer God's existence through the creation, or infer God's existence through our conscious. And so those
mm,
kind of uh, arguments of natural theology kind of correspond to general revelation in that regard. Plus,
yeah.
yeah, plus like the moral argument, it definitely hits most people because a lot of people maybe don't care about philosophical arguments, or they're not connected to it in ways that we are. But we talk about like things that are really good and evil, everybody has an opinion on that.
Yeah.
So sometimes you
Well,
might oh yeah, go ahead.
no, I was gonna say it's certainly one of the more powerful arguments, because, and I think this is one thing Jordan Peterson's really shed light on. Our argument in favor of moral realism is typically we appeal to intuition, which is nobody really believes that the Holocaust was only subjectively evil, that it was only a matter of opinion. They believe it was really evil. But Jordan Peterson goes a step further and says, it's impossible to even behave as though there isn't an objective right or wrong. We don't behave as though these things are relative. And so, yeah, I agree that that's just kind of, you have to just deny such, obvious intuitions to kind of dismiss the argument.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like JP Moreland, for example, when he's talking with people who say, oh, uh, morals are just relative and all this, and then he just says, okay, you know he just goes up, takes their stereo and walks off, and they're like, hey, you can't do that. And he's like, well, it's true for me. So who are you to say that it's wrong if everything's just relative? And he's like, no. So people are just relative to stuff that they don't care about, but it's stuff that's really meaningful to them. They're very
Hmm.
like absolute and objective. But yeah, so everybody can't live consistent believing that moral values and duties are just relative, because they all hold stuff dear to them that they hold objective and absolute. And so
Hmm.
I don't think a lot of people know how to ground those values that they hold dearly.
Hmm. Well, it's funny. It's funny that you also brought up the Kalam argument, because I feel like when the Kalam argument first, you know, was becoming, a major argument among philosophers, the premise in there that could be denied was that the universe began to exist, right? So if you have two premises, one is that everything that begins to exist has a cause, and then two, the universe began to exist. Well, the first premise, it was so obvious. Of course, everything that begins to exist has a cause. Like who in the right mind would deny that? And so they could deny the second premise, which was that the universe began to exist. The problem is that the evidence in favor of the universe beginning is so powerful now you can't deny it. And so what you see is the atheist philosophers will deny the first premise now. And I feel like something similar has happened with the moral argument. Um, it was so obvious that morality was objective. So the premise they denied was that you needed God to ground that. And I think, especially through the work of William Lane Craig and Frank Turek and guys like them, that premise that you need God to ground it has become really, really well founded. And so now people are kind of retreating to, well, denying that morality is objective.
Yeah, I think it's crazy how people will shift, which premise they deny or affirm just so they can escape the conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
So, um, but yeah, when it comes to like the moral argument, I feel like people realize it, but they don't think about the where it leads to. They kind of just know about it, but when like people like William Craig, they come up and they formulate it like in a way where they can actually see where it leads to, then people get uncomfortable. They're like, okay, well, I'm not sure if I want to go that route, but I do
Mm-hmm.
affirm, objective moral values and duties. But yeah, it's weird how people just flip flop just to avoid the conclusion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's one of those things like obviously you and I we can't cover every possible naturalistic explanation for morality in this video, and so there'll probably be a lot of comments saying, well, we didn't address this or that. But for me, if we were just trying to boil it down to as simple as possible, I think there would be two points I would argue that lead to God, which is that morality is objective. That certain things are really good regardless of opinion. It wouldn't matter if every single person on Earth thought that what Hitler did was right, it still would be wrong. And the same with evil. Certain things are really evil regardless of our opinion. And then two, that has to be grounded in a person outside of humanity to which we have some kind of duty or responsibility to. And it can't be grounded in some kind of abstract object like a Platonic form of good, because we don't have moral obligations to things or to just abstract objects. We only have moral obligations to people. And so I think, obviously you and I not dealing with every possible naturalistic explanation, I think it has to be ultimately be grounded in a person outside of us, because then it's just really just dependent on our theories, or maybe what evolution has brought to us, and even premises like well-being. You have to assume those. You can't make a rational argument towards them, because as soon as you get in that, but you can be making rational arguments to anything. Tim Stratton brought up when he was on the show, some people wouldn't assume that human flourishing is a good thing as a fundamental premise. They think humans are harming the planet, so it's got to be humans that got to go.
Yeah, that's true. Like on Sam Harris's debate with William Lane Craig on like the moral landscape and where morals come from. Like he affirms that morality is objective, but he kind of puts it on a moral landscape where like the peaks are occupied by people or that have actions that benefit humanity the most. So things that make human flourishing possible are on the peaks, and then people who kind of are detrimental to human flourishing are on the bottom. But William Craig pretty much said that if the peaks were somehow occupied by the psychopath or the rapist, that it would no longer be a moral landscape, because
Mm-hmm.
because there is possible worlds where maybe raping people would flourish humanity, for example, and then they would be on the peaks of the moral landscape. And so you can say that they are not objective in that sense, that there's worlds where rape would be right because might
Mm-hmm.
benefit humanity. And so he kind of pointed out that flaw in Sam Harris's his argument for objective morality. Pretty much is just based upon what can flourish humanity the most. And plus, Bill Craig also kind of says, why just humanity? Why not the flourishing of corn or animals or rats, for example? Why
Mm-hmm.
humanity? And you're kind of uh, have some sort of a speciesism. But
Yeah.
yeah. So unless you kind of ground morality on like you said, like a person, but an unchanging person whom they don't change, that's the only legitimate way to kind of ground morality. Because if it's
Yeah.
something that's that can change, like, some random person, then what might be good now, not good later, and vice versa. You still hear me?
Yeah. Yeah,
Sorry,
no,
my batteries ran out.
that's okay. I can still hear you, so I'll kind of take over while you work on that. Yeah, I think that's right, and I think Frank Turek points out that these theories, they always smuggle in a metaphysical ethic to even get off the ground. So when Sam Harris is talking about the moral landscape, it's like, well, what is that moral landscape that he's talking about? It seems that that would have to be some kind of metaphysical ethic that he's basing his theory on, to say, okay, well, on the moral landscape, certain actions are here as opposed to other actions being here. And I feel like Michael Shermer does the same thing when he talks about the moral arc, how we're kind of progressing as humanity goes forward, towards, say, better societies. And my question would be, well, where does that moral arc end? Because if it doesn't end somewhere, like you and I would argue, a personal transcendent anchor, then the moral arc is just it's floating in nowhere, and it could be going backwards, or it could be ending. Maybe slavery becomes good again at some point in the future. So even Michael Shermer is smuggling in a metaphysical ethic, which is that this moral arc that is objectively judging, what our actions, where our actions would rank on that.
Yeah, it's true. It's like any sort of foundation other than God is just literally just it's shifting. It shifts,
Mhm.
and so, like I said, one thing that may be good now could become bad later, and so with God, things that are good are objectively good because God is unchanging. So things that are bad, like rape, for example, like, will always be bad. It will never be determined on, you know, cultural norms, or, what if down the line some society says, we gotta rape so we can continue humanity, and all this, and so then it might become a good thing. But with God, like some things like rape or, torturing a child, for example, will always be wrong. And like I feel like that's true. I can't think of any sort of situation where that can possibly be a right thing to do.
Yeah.
So yeah, to me, like I can't even conceive of another sort of foundation where would be better than what God is. Especially since He's uh, the most holy, the grounding of values, and He's the standard. And so anything else is just a substandard.
Hmm.
It's just,
Yeah.
yes.
It's funny. I like one of the things you mentioned about God being changeless. He's an unchanging standard, and the reason, by the way, that God is good. Some people kind of have this argument. Well, what if God was just evil, and then so we'd be obligated to behave in evil ways? And the response I typically give is, because God is infinite in every metaphysical attribute that has positive ontological status. So it has some actual metaphysical existence. And evil, I would argue, isn't like that. It's not on a par with good, right? And God just kind of arbitrarily is good rather than evil. I think good actually exists. It has some positive existence. And so God exemplifies that to its maximum. And it's only any deviation away from that or lack in a good thing that is evil.
Yeah, that's kind of like his analogy with like um, coldness and heat. Kind of
Mhm.
like there's no such thing as cold. Cold is
Right.
just um, an absence of heat. It doesn't exist ontologically, but or kind of like the other example of light and darkness. Pretty much, it's just the absence of something else. It doesn't exist by itself. You can have good without evil, but you can't have evil without good. Evil can't just be there as like an ontological standard, and then
Mhm.
goodness, it's like only when there's a lack of goodness does evil exist. And so if there was, you could have no evil at all, but you can't have no good at all. You can't just have evil just by itself.
Right.
So yeah, it's like evil is like spoiled goodness. It's just something that you would need good to even exist.
Yeah, so I want us to hold on to that term changeless because that's going to relate to what we're going to come around to talking about God and his relationship to time. But to get there, I actually want to, since you mentioned the Kalam cosmological argument, I'd like to, spend some time on that if we could. So I do think it would probably is unnecessary for us to even start kind of go into the evidence for the beginning of the universe. Maybe we could just touch on a few reasons why we think that the law of causality applies there and why that would have to be a personal creator. So suppose somebody asked you, they said, yeah, well, the law of causality can't really apply in the absence of time. And so prior to the universe being created, there was no time, so we can't have the law of causality. How would you respond to that?
Well, you're talking about like the contingency argument, or
No, the Kalam argument. Because, one of our premises is that whatever begins to exist has a cause. And so typically people deny that. They say, well, no, the law of causality doesn't apply to the universe because there
yeah,
was no time before it came into being.
yeah. So like the first premise, for example, is like anything that begins to exist has a cause, and then they usually kind of say, okay, what caused God, for example. But like
Hmm.
the argument itself, pretty much says whatever begins to exist. And so when you talk
Yeah.
about God, who is by definition the uncaused first cause, and so he never begins to exist by definition. He's the being that exists by the necessity of his own nature. And so you have, anything that exists, whether it's planets, universes, God, for example, like they either fall into two categories. They're either contingent or they exist by the necessity of their own nature. And so things that are contingent would be obviously planets, universes, us. We could have failed to exist, but
Hmm.
beings like God, who exist by the necessity of their own nature, they cannot fail to exist. It's impossible for them not to exist.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good distinction to kind of realize between like what caused the universe or what caused God, or it's like there's only two options. You can either exist by
Yeah.
necessity of your own nature or exist contingently. So
Yeah, dependent on something else.
yeah,
Yeah, I think that's really a good distinction because, to me it seems arbitrary. On the one hand, I would say that the person making that claim that the first premise is false can't just assert that. They have to give us some kind of argument or reasons to believe that the law of causality wouldn't apply to the universe. And I think it's just kind of just arbitrary because you made the point that there are things in the universe that are contingent. We know they're dependent on something else. We know that they need something else to explain their existence. And to me, it makes no sense to just when people say the universe as if it's something different, when really it's just the collection of all the things that we know are contingent. That to then say the universe and speak of all of them as a collective set, and then to say that all of them together aren't contingent, to me is just nonsense. I don't think you're getting anywhere by doing that.
yeah, they kind of say, the law of causality is true of things in the universe, but not of the universe. And so
Hmm.
they'll kind of dismiss that principle, you know, when it comes to the whole collective, you know, that's pretty much like the taxi cab fallacy, where they'll like, yeah, the principle works, but they'll stop when it reaches to the point where, it would cause them to kind of look outside the universe and,
Yeah.
see that there's maybe a creator of the universe. And they're like, okay. So yeah, I think that's where you probably apply the taxi cab fallacy on that regard.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. And two, what I think the objection kind of assumes when they say that the law of causality needs to function in time is it assumes that causality only works in sequence. That you have the cause and then you have the effect. And William Lane Craig, he always points out examples of simultaneous causation. So where and he's quoting another philosopher on this, but if you had a ball resting in a cushion, the cause of the imprint is the ball's resting in it, but that's simultaneous. And the ball and cushion could have been existing from eternity past. And yet we would never say that maybe that the imprint of the cushion is the cause of the balls being round. No, it's the ball's weight is the cause of that imprint. And so that's simultaneous causation. And he would argue that, God's act of creating the universe is simultaneous with the beginning of the universe, because there was no time beforehand. God was existing timelessly, and then his choice to create the universe is simultaneous with the Big Bang.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. You can have both at the exact same moment and not two separate moments. But yeah, I do like that bowling ball and the pillow cushion analogy. Yeah, seems to make sense to me.
This brings us to one thing we want to talk about. And look, both of us, but before we get into this, we have to make a disclaimer. We're not experts in this. I've not quite finished the book, but we're going to talk a little bit about time.
This book,
time and eternity. But I've been listening to a ton of lectures by William Lane Craig on the subject, and I've done a lot of thinking about it. And it's funny because we're talking about the Kalam Cosmological Argument, and one of the things that I don't know if you would call it a refutation to the argument, but it certainly would render the argument not successful if atheists adopted a B theory of time, which I haven't figured out quite why they haven't done that yet. And they also could do that with a lot of arguments if they adopted, Platonism. But before we get too far into that, we might want to outline what the A theory and B theory of time are. So among philosophers, there are two standard theories of time. One is the A theory, which most people who haven't even thought about it, this is what they would assume, right? This is what we assume is true. It's the tensed theory of time, which is the present is real, and it's privileged in that sense. We exist in the present. The past is gone. We can never get that back. And the future doesn't exist in any real sense. It's pure potentiality. And so temporal becoming is an objective feature of the universe. Things really do come into and go out of existence. Then there's the B theory of time, or the tenseless theory of time, which holds that the entire timeline of human existence, or not even human existence, but of the universe, exists as one block. That past, present, and future are all equally real, and it's only our subjective experience on the timeline that makes the present feel like the present. So to you and I, this is the present right now, right? But to the people living in 1870, that's the present. And to the people living in 2525, that's the present. And so temporal becoming is an illusion. Things really don't come into and go out of existence. And I've always found it weird why atheists wouldn't adopt that view of time, because then on the Kalam Cosmological Argument, saying that the universe began to exist is really just saying that this timeline has a front edge, right, where the sequences started, but the entire history as a whole could have existed from eternities past. I don't know what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, when it comes to like time and what people kind of adopt, it's very inconsistent. People have their own views of what time is, and I think even like in pop culture, when people think about like time travel, for example, I think they tend to do think of more like a B theory form of time where, it would be possible to go in the past and change things if things were really, if the past is equally as real as the present, then you can actually go there in the past and maybe change things and whatnot, or even go into the future. But yeah, I think even amongst like physicists, like the B theory of time is actually pretty prevalent in those kind of models that they use. But yeah, sometimes I do agree with like the A theory of time, where things come into existence and out of existence. But I do flirt with the idea of maybe a B theory of time, because I think that. Sorry.
That's okay.
It's going into sleep mode because I haven't been touching it.
That's funny.
But yeah, it is fascinating to think that we could possibly go in the past or in the future. But
yeah, I'll link to it. I might send it to you. There's a really interesting article written by Jason Lyle about time travel, and he argues, scientifically speaking, that time travel into the future would be possible, but time travel into the past would not be. And he kind of argues that first from scientific grounds and then kind of from philosophical and theological grounds. And it's just really interesting to think about how that could work. But even in the way he talks about it, I think it kind of, goes. I hold to the A theory of time. I think that's the common sense view, and I think it's the true view. I think there are problems with the B theory. But kind of where you and I are going with this is God's relationship to time. So there is a debate, among Christian philosophers about whether God becomes temporal when he creates the universe, or whether he remains timeless when he creates the universe. I know William Lane Craig would hold that he becomes temporal, and then there are guys like Frank Turek who would hold that he remains timeless. Which one of those would you say you line up on?
Yeah, I definitely agree with Bill Craig on this, because when God creates the universe, he does have he takes on a causal relationship with with the creation. So, there was a time where God existed alone, and then now there's a time where God coexists with the universe. And so there's change in that. There's change in how God relates to humans, or even if you were to even talk about the incarnation, like that to me is very clear evidence that God is related to the world in such a way where he's not outside the universe, not interacting. Like the fact that he does interact with the world in such a way, to me, shows that he is in time.
Mm-hmm.
Or even God's knowledge of tense facts. So like God, he would say, it is 3 o'clock right now, or it will be 3:01, or it was 2:59. So he's always has these tense facts. So this knowledge of tense facts does show that there's a progression of change, which implies a passage of time.
Mm-hmm.
So I think God's relation to the creation and God's knowledge of tense facts does seem to show that God is in time.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I think I agree with that. And I think there are some philosophical problems with arguing that God remains timeless after he creates the universe. We'll get into those. But I think one of the reasons people would adopt that view is because I think they have a misconception that if God is somehow temporal or in time, that he's somehow limited by time, or that, the universe it puts a constraint on him or limits him. And I don't agree with that, because you and I are limited by time in the sense that we age, and as we get older, we'll get weaker, and eventually we'll die. God isn't limited in that way. He doesn't age in that way. He doesn't get weaker. His attributes stay the same. And as far as him being limited by the universe, I think God becoming temporal, he made a decision. He made a conscious decision to create the universe. And William Lane Craig argues that by definition, that means God can't remain timeless, because let's say God were to destroy the universe and destroy time, it wouldn't actually work in a logical sense, because then it would have to be true from God's standpoint that there was a time when the universe existed, and there was a time when he created it. But even that is still assuming a temporal relationship, if that is technically in the past.
yeah, I agree. Once he sets time and decides to take everything away, you can't really erase the fact that there was a prior moment where there was creation and then there wasn't creation. So I think once time is actually created, it's forever there,
Mm,
which I
yeah.
think is very fascinating.
I agree. Yeah, and it was God's conscious choice to engage in that, and so I don't think he's limited. And so one of the things you mentioned earlier is that God is changeless, and I think to certain philosophers and theologians, they kind of run into a problem here, which is if we're arguing God is um, temporal and goes through temporal changes, well, then that affects the doctrine of changelessness. Um, but William Lane Craig points out that there's a distinct difference in saying God is changeless and God is changeable. And so even though you and I hold that he becomes temporal, we still hold that he's changeless in his essential attributes, in his omnipotence, his, omnibenevolence, and his love and justice. His character is changeless. Nevertheless, he is changeable in certain trivial ways you mentioned, as far as knowledge. God has a knowledge that this is the present, and say tomorrow is the future. But then 2 days from now, that knowledge would be false, because then tomorrow would be yesterday to him. And so his knowledge claims are changing. And also his relationships are changing. And I really like that you brought up the incarnation and Jesus, because, if God is timeless, I've heard one philosopher say, I don't remember his name, but that God is timeless, but he can enter into time. And, that sounds good. The problem is that if God is still timeless, then as far as he's regarded, Jesus entering into history kind of goes on a relative timeline, which I do think is kind of self-contradictory. Before Jesus entered human history, God has a temporal relationship to the universe. I will, incarnate in the universe, and I will die for sins. Now God's position is, I did already do those things. And so I think, especially with the incarnation, it creates much more problems if we say that God is timeless without the universe, rather than he has this temporal relationship with it.
Yeah, I agree. I think you gotta have to kind of consider God's internal change versus his external change. So, when it comes to God's internal change, nothing changes about him internally, like his properties of being omniscient, and all this. And so that part doesn't change, but his external, he does experience external change, or his relations to, to time or to other people. That part changes too, but it's nothing that affects God, in his essential attributes. And so,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so when God enters time, like, he still remains changeless, but externally, like, to how he relates time into his creation, that part changes too, but it's nothing that would make him, better or worse. But yeah, like you said, like the incarnation, it just seems to me to be clear evidence that God is in time. I can't even conceive of a coherent, doctrine of God being outside of time, but yet still in Jesus Christ. And so
Well,
that part
yeah,
always, yeah.
it'd be weird. It would kind of force the Christian adopting that perspective to adopt the B theory of time, which he could do. But to me, it still doesn't solve the problem, because if God is withdrawing from time, right, if he has the ability to enter into time and then withdraw from it, well, in his present state of being withdrawn, when did Jesus enter human history? You couldn't answer that question if God is now outside of time. I do think that specifically puts God on a temporal time scale of having certain relationships to things. And, again, it was true that he would enter human history. And now for God, it's true that he already did those things. And I just don't see how you can argue God remains timeless, because then it makes that question, you can't answer that question. Well, when did Jesus enter human history? It can't be at all times at once. And it's just a weird thing to me.
Yeah, I think people think that, if they think of God in time, that somehow that diminishes God in some way. Where, I would disagree. I feel like the fact that God does enter time, is actually better. I think that God now has interactions with people, as opposed to kind of just being in like a timeless state where he's kind of, you know, almost like frozen in time, for example, versus actually being involved. And so the fact that he's in time, I feel like his involvement with his creation is more evident,
Yeah.
that he can actually interact with people and we can interact with him. I think that's
Mm-hmm.
actually a good thing, as opposed to kind of God just creating the universe and, staying back and just kind of being impersonal and watching it just unfold, which I think that's, in a way unloving. I think it is more loving to be in creation and being a part of creation and kind of revealing himself to creation. I think does show his love in a certain kind of, weird way, that we can actually interact with God and God can, interact with us. That's actually a good thing and not something that diminishes God in any way. So
Yeah, I agree. I had some I was gonna say on that, and I can't remember what it was. Oh, yeah. Hopefully, I'll be able to actually have Frank Turk back on the show because I would like to give him the chance to defend that position instead of me just kind of going after with him without him here to defend it because I know he does hold to the eighth theory of time. So I certainly don't want to straw man him since I haven't talked to him about this particular thing yet. I think it would be interesting to get him back on there and maybe be able to discuss this and hash some of these things out. We don't have a ton of time left. Were there any maybe other arguments or topics you wanted to cover before we go?
how about this? What is your
Okay.
favorite argument for God's existence?
Ooh, so I'm partial to the moral argument myself. Um, Only because one thing I always do with my own ideas is I try to play devil's advocate and try to find the weaknesses in my own ideas so that way I can keep I can develop them as strongly as possible. And I'm always interested in the best arguments for atheism. I don't want to just find a bunch of weak arguments that are easy for me to knock down. Um, the reason I'm partial to the moral argument is because I think if I were to try to put myself in the atheist's shoes and refute a lot of these arguments, like the Kalam, like the contingency, like the design argument, I think for the most part you can actually do that if you adopt a B theory of time and heavyweight Platonism. So that the Platonism gives you immaterial realities, and the B theory of time allows you to kind of stop at the universe as a brute fact without having to extrapolate beforehand. But I don't think the moral argument is susceptible to the same criticism because, again, I don't think you can ground morality in an abstract Platonic form. And so morality, the B theory of time wouldn't affect it because morality doesn't change or isn't affected by time. And you would still need a personal agent outside of humanity to ground morality. So I'm personally partial to the moral argument because I don't think it's susceptible to the same weaknesses that the other arguments are.
Yeah. Yeah, the moral argument is definitely my favorite too. But yeah, I like how when people when you bring up the moral argument, they always have to bring up, you know, Bible, you know, ethics or like how God destroyed the Canaanites or whatnot, and it kind of just leads on down this trail and it just kind of leads away from the argument, kind of
Mm-hmm.
too far astray. But yeah, that one definitely hits home the most. It definitely gets people kind of exposing why they dislike God or the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah, I mean, it's just a red herring. It doesn't actually deal with the argument. At most, what it would allow them to do is to say, well, there's probably a different theistic God to ground morality, but it's certainly not the God of the Bible because look how evil he is. I think that's the best it would get them. I don't think it would get them saying that there is no God that grounds morality because what they're doing by bringing up the objections is affirming an objective moral standard by which to judge the God of the Old Testament. And look, and I'll admit, I'm not an Old Testament scholar. Like, I often refer people to Is God a Moral Monster by Paul Copan or Dennis Prager. He just wrote the Rational Bible, and he did it on Exodus, and I think he plans to do it on the other books too, which that's really good. And it's a really good treatment of why these laws were the way they were and why they seem to be immoral and different kinds of laws and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I'm not an Old Testament scholar, I admit that, but I like dealing with the philosophy of morality.
yeah, so I think our argument, we're trying to deal with like the, moral ontology, and then they're here kind of arguing, moral epistemology, and so it's kind
Well,
of
yeah,
two
they
separate
never get
things.
outside it. It's one of those things that it's the Christian and the atheist they're having two different conversations. Like almost always when they have this debate, when the atheist claims he can ground objective morality through a theory, the theory never justifies the ontological foundation of morality. It never actually gets into why morality exists or why certain things are right or wrong. Their theory only ever covers why we know those things. The epistemology of it. And it's one of those things, and I think, often us as apologists, we kind of grant a premise that I think it is fair in a way. We'll say, well, you don't need God or the Bible to know morality, right? Because that's epistemology, and you don't need religion to know it. And one of the things Stephen Crowder pointed out, which I thought was brilliant, was maybe we can grant that on some of the extremes, like with murder and theft, right? We kind of intuitively know these things, but a lot of the stuff we seem to intuitively know is kind of just a privilege of being born in Western culture that was founded on a Judeo-Christian ethic, because not all societies valued forgiveness. That wasn't considered a human virtue always. Truth wasn't considered a human virtue in most societies. And so all the morals that we talk about weren't actually things that people for the majority of human history intuitively knew without religion. And it took a Judeo-Christian ethic, underpinning for the West to kind of really value, what would you say, value these virtues like forgiveness and truth. And, now, because we've been brought up in it and it's just saturated our thinking so much, we tend to think these things are intuitive, but that wouldn't be true for the majority of human history.
Yeah, that's definitely a good point. We are grounded in the Judeo-Christian, ethics, and that, like you said, we just take it for granted that we just have these sort of these norms. But yeah, I definitely like I said, like that argument of ontology and epistemology. Like it's crazy, like how when we do have these conversations with unbelievers, that how it just it goes one way, and then we always have to kind of bring them back to the foundation. Like, no, we're arguing for the foundation, not how we come to know certain things are right and wrong. Like we know they're right and wrong, but what's
Yeah.
the foundation for them? And so, yeah. Even sometimes too, like I get caught off guard too, because they'll kind of bring up some sort of Bible passage, and I'm like, oh man, okay, let me answer that real quick, and then I gotta take you back to what the argument was trying to convince you in the first place. But yeah,
I
it's
mean, and hey,
definitely
look, fair enough. Again, not an Old Testament scholar. There are certain things I look at in the Old Testament. I'm like, whoa, that seems a bit rough. I don't quite know what's going on there. So I can admit that. But I would say, Christianity as a whole has always been the most consistent worldview I've studied. There always does tend to be answers, and if you know where to look and the right people to read and study, there are answers to these things. So I would encourage anybody who maybe has a particular Old Testament passage in mind to go look that up.
yeah, I agree. I feel like you shouldn't kind of throw away the whole idea of God just based off some sort of Bible ethic that happened 4,000 years ago, where we may not know the complete context of why they thought that, or the laws that kind of encourage it or forbid it. So kind of like you kind of have to kind of know how to kind of base your beliefs, not just off some sort of peripheral, little kind of nuance over here, but like kind of look at the foundation. Like, is there a foundation for any sort of morality, or you can't just base off your beliefs off some sort of Bible discrepancy. And so, yeah, I wish people wouldn't kind of do that. I think it
Yeah,
bothers me. Like,
I mean,
well,
I think it's a perfectly legitimate question to ask. But one thing I might encourage an unbeliever, and maybe other Christians would get upset with me for saying this, but maybe just if if you're a beginner looking at this stuff, look, you don't actually have to accept the Old Testament as the inerrant word from God to become a Christian. I think if you just treat the Bible like you would treat any historical document, hey, look, maybe there's a lot of tribal warfare going on, and that was the history that was recorded, and maybe some of it hypothetically is unjustified. That doesn't mean Jesus didn't come and do what he did and was who he claimed to be. That's one of the things J. Warren Wallace talks about, is you don't have to assume these documents are inerrant to get good history from them. And so long as Jesus was who he claimed to be and did what the New Testament documents say he did, and there's good historical evidence for that, then Christianity is true, and you can at least just to adopt the New Testament and then maybe go from there.
yeah, I agree. I think Bill Craig also, brings up that biblical inspiration and inerrancy is kind of farther in the web of core beliefs. Like you can still be a Christian and hold on to what you hold dear, and maybe not believe the Bible is inspired, which he does believe it is, but
Mhm.
it's not a necessary thing for you to kind of come to the conclusion that Jesus raised from the dead and that God exists. Like, when it comes to like the core facts and core beliefs, like, God exists, Jesus raised from the dead, are like at the core. Biblical or inerrancy are kind of further along the web of core beliefs, and so something that might be over here, wouldn't affect too much of the core beliefs. But if you got rid of the core beliefs, then the whole thing kind of just falls apart. And so,
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And so I guess one last thing I'd like to suggest before we go is, obviously I can see the comment section lighting up now. Look, you and I couldn't cover all the possible naturalistic explanations for morality, but if you feel like we haven't covered something, or you feel like there is a theory that justifies objective morality on naturalism, write it out and then ask yourself, is this actually just explaining how we know it from an epistemological standpoint, or does this actually get outside of human opinion and human societies and human cultures to justify why this thing is truly good or why this thing is truly evil, regardless of our opinion about it and maybe our historical development on it.
Yeah, we definitely didn't cover, we would just scratch the surface of everything.
Yeah.
But yeah, and this is honestly my first time on anything like this, so I'm not as comfortable as you, but
well,
yeah,
I'm nervous inside. That's kind of how that goes for me. I get like really nervous before interviews and stuff. But it always seems worth it. As long as I don't say anything too stupid, watching it back, I feel like I did okay.
Oh man, you're amazing. Like I'm constantly blown away by how young you are, but yet you're still doing all this with the big shots, and it's still just like, wow. It inspires me to kind of maybe go above and beyond, my own comfort zone. And so, yeah,
well, I really appreciate you saying that, and I'm really blessed by God that these guys, Frank Turek and Jay Werner Wallace and Greg Kokel, have agreed to come on my show, because I don't have that many subscribers. They could say, he's not worth my time, and so they've been very gracious to me, and so I'm very appreciative of that, and I appreciate what you're saying. So the Facebook page is Thrive Apologetics. James Rebel Jamias, thank you so much for stopping by, sir, and I hope to have you back soon.
Yeah, man. Yeah, thanks for having me.